Hello? Welcome to the Daily Life Stories channel. This morning, beneath a blanket of mist covering the mountains, an old story begins to awaken. And if you're ready, come with me into a story about a promise that waited for 35 years. The morning fog rolled slowly across the mountains like a quiet tide. It crept over the dry hills, across the broken fences, through rows of old coffee trees that had not seen a good harvest in years. In the middle of that quiet land stood a man. Daniel Carter was 62 years old. His shoulders were slightly bent from decades of work. His hair had turned the color of winter frost. His hands were rough and cracked like the soil beneath his boots. He stood still in the field as if he were listening to something the world could no longer hear. Not the wind, not the birds. Something older, something buried in memory. Then the silence broke. Far away at first, a low mechanical roar. Daniel slowly lifted his head. The sound grew louder. Heavy engines, metal grinding against dirt, bulldozers. Daniel turned toward the narrow road that led to the farm. Through the fog, he saw movement. Trucks, large yellow machines, construction workers climbing down, and then something else. A tall metal pole being raised beside the road. The workers struggled with it for a moment. Then the sign unfolded. Even from far away, Daniel could read the bold black letters, "Luxury Mountain Resort opening soon." The sign stood tall above the old coffee fields. Bright, clean, new. Everything the farm was not. Daniel stared at it for a long time. His face showed no anger, no shock, just a quiet heaviness. The kind that comes from seeing something you always feared would eventually happen. Slowly, he walked toward one of the coffee trees. It was one of the oldest trees on the land. Its branches were thin now. Many leaves had fallen, but the trunk still stood strong. Daniel placed his hand gently against the bark. For a moment, he closed his eyes, and the past returned. 35 years earlier, the farm had looked completely different. The air smelled sweet with ripe coffee cherries. The hills were alive with workers laughing and baskets overflowing with fruit. Daniel was young then, strong, hopeful, and beside him stood a young woman, Emily. Her dark hair moved softly in the wind. She held a small coffee seedling in her hands. Daniel had just planted it. The tiny tree barely reached his knee. Emily looked at it and laughed. "You think this little thing will survive up here?" she said. Daniel smiled. "It will grow. Everything grows here." Emily stepped closer to him. For a moment she looked serious, more serious than Daniel had ever seen her. Then she said quietly, "If one day you come back here and I am not here anymore." Daniel frowned. "Emily, why would you say that?" She shook her head gently. "Just promise me something. Promise me you will not sell this land, no matter what happens." Daniel looked around the farm. The hills, the trees, the sky that seemed endless above them. Then he looked back at her. "I promise," he said. Emily smiled again, the kind of smile that made the whole world feel warm. And then the memory faded. The fog returned. The dry field returned. Daniel opened his eyes. His hand was still resting on the same tree, but it was no longer a seedling. It was the old coffee tree standing beside him now. 35 years had passed, and he had never broken his promise. Behind him, a car door slammed. Daniel slowly turned. A long black car had stopped near the entrance to the farm. It did not belong here. Everything about it looked expensive. Clean, polished, the opposite of the dusty road. A driver stepped out first. Then he opened the back door. A woman stepped out. She was well-dressed, elegant. Her posture was confident, the kind of confidence that comes from living in cities far away from places like this. She looked around the farm slowly. Her eyes moved across the broken fences, the old house, the fields of dying coffee trees. Then she began walking toward Daniel. Her heels made soft sounds on the gravel. Daniel watched her approach. At first, he thought she must be from the construction company, maybe a representative from the resort project. But something about her presence made the air feel strangely heavy. She stopped several steps away from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fog drifted quietly between them. Then the woman finally said, "This farm never belonged to you." Her voice was calm, not angry, not loud, but every word landed like a stone. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He stared at her. "I beg your pardon," he said slowly. The woman looked at the old coffee trees around them, then back at Daniel. "This land belongs to my family," she continued. "It always has. And now it is time for it to come back to us." Daniel felt something strange move inside his chest. Confusion, disbelief, but also something deeper. Something he could not name yet. He studied her face carefully. Her eyes, her cheekbones, the way she held her shoulders, and suddenly his heart skipped. For a brief moment the fog shifted, the light changed, and Daniel saw something impossible. The woman standing before him looked almost exactly like someone he had once known. Someone he had waited for. Someone he had never stopped remembering. "Emily." "No, that cannot be," he whispered under his breath. The woman tilted her head slightly. "Did you say something?" Daniel did not answer. He was staring at her face, trying to understand what his mind was telling him. Time had changed everything, but something about her eyes felt painfully familiar. The woman crossed her arms. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The name echoed inside his mind. Emily Carter. The same name, the same voice. But that was impossible. The Emily he knew would be the same age as him, not standing here looking decades younger. His heart began beating faster. The woman looked toward the large sign near the road. "Luxury Mountain Resort," she said calmly. "Construction begins soon, which means this farm will be cleared." Daniel finally found his voice. "That is not going to happen," he said quietly. The woman studied him for a moment, almost as if she were trying to understand something. Then she spoke again. "That is not your decision anymore." Daniel felt the old coffee tree beneath his hand. Rough bark. Solid. Still standing after 35 years. He looked at the woman again, and a single question slowly formed in his mind. What if the past never truly disappeared? What if it simply waited, just like he had, for 35 years waiting for someone to come back? And now the woman who looked like Emily stood in front of him, claiming the land he had protected his entire life. But the question that haunted him most was this: was it really her? Or was fate playing one last cruel trick on a man who had already waited too long? The mountains woke slowly, long before the sun climbed over the hills. Daniel Carter was already awake. He had not used an alarm clock in more than 20 years. His body had learned the rhythm of the farm long ago. Even now, when most of the land had stopped producing, the habit remained. Daniel opened his eyes to the quiet creak of the wooden house. The roof shifted slightly as the night air warmed. A loose window frame tapped softly in the breeze. He sat up slowly. For a moment, He simply listened. No trucks, no engines. Only the distant call of a bird somewhere down the valley. This was the hour Daniel loved the most. The world had not started rushing yet. He walked to the kitchen. The floorboards complained gently beneath his steps. The house had grown old with him. He placed a kettle on the stove. While the water heated, Daniel stepped outside onto the small wooden porch. The sky was still dark blue. A thin line of orange waited behind the mountains. He looked across the farm. Years ago, the view had been alive with movement. Workers walking through the rows of coffee trees. The smell of roasted beans drifting from the drying house. Trucks arriving before sunrise to collect the harvest. Now the land looked tired. Many rows of coffee trees had withered. The irrigation pipes were broken. One of the old tractors had been sitting beside the barn for so long that grass had begun growing through its tires. Daniel leaned against the railing and breathed in the cold morning air. Then he whispered quietly, "Good morning, Emily." No one heard him. No one ever did. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. Daniel poured hot water into a chipped ceramic cup. He sat alone at the small wooden table near the window. Steam rose slowly from the tea. There were 2 chairs at the table, but the second chair had been empty for 35 years. He took a slow sip, and as he did every morning, his eyes drifted toward the same place. On the wall above the fireplace hung an old photograph. 2 young people stood in a field of coffee trees. A younger Daniel, and beside him a smiling woman, Emily. The photograph had faded slightly with time. The edges had curled, but Daniel had never taken it down. Some people said holding on to memories like that was unhealthy. Daniel never argued. He simply continued living the only way he knew how. After finishing his tea, he put on his work boots and walked outside again. The sun was beginning to rise. Golden light stretched across the valley. Daniel picked up an old watering can. He walked slowly toward the small patch of coffee trees that were still alive. There were only 12 of them now. 12 trees out of what had once been thousands. He watered them carefully. One by one, like old friends he refused to abandon. As he reached the last tree, he paused. This one stood slightly apart from the others. Its trunk was thicker, older. Daniel placed his hand on the bark. This was the tree he had planted with Emily 35 years ago, back when it was just a tiny seedling, back when the world still felt full of promises. The tree had survived drought, storms, neglect, just like him. For a long moment, Daniel simply stood there. Then a voice suddenly broke the quiet. "You still talking to that tree, Daniel?" Daniel turned slowly. An old pickup truck had stopped by the dirt road. Inside sat George Whitaker. George was Daniel's neighbor and one of the few people who still visited the farm. George leaned out the window with a small grin. "Morning, Daniel." Daniel nodded politely. "Morning, George." George climbed out of the truck and looked around the field. "Same as always," he said. "Dry land, broken fences, and one stubborn old farmer." Daniel smiled faintly. "Something like that." George kicked at the dusty soil with his boot. "You know what people in town say about you?" Daniel did not answer. George continued anyway. "They say Daniel Carter is guarding a ghost." Daniel looked back at the coffee tree. "Maybe I am," he said quietly. George shook his head. "You could have sold this place 10 years ago. 15 even. Developers offered good money. You would be living in a nice house by the lake." Daniel said nothing. George looked at him more seriously now. "Tell me the truth, Daniel. "You still waiting for her?" The question hung in the air. Daniel took a slow breath. He stared at the mountains in the distance. "Some promises take longer than people expect," he said. George sealed. "Daniel, 35 years is not waiting. That is surviving." Daniel turned toward the old barn. "Maybe, but it is the only life I know." George looked toward the road where the large resort sign had been placed the day before. "You saw the construction company, right?" he asked. Daniel nodded. George rubbed his chin. "They are buying land everywhere around here. Half the valley has already sold. It is only a matter of time before they come for this place." Daniel finally looked directly at George. "Let them come," he said. George studied his friend for a moment. "You really mean that?" Daniel nodded again. George climbed back into his truck. Before closing the door, he asked one last question. "Daniel, what if she never comes back?" Daniel looked at the old coffee tree. Its branches moved gently in the morning wind. Then he answered quietly, "Then at least she will know I kept my promise." George drove away slowly. The dust from his truck drifted across the road. Daniel stood alone again. The farm was quiet, but somewhere far away, machines were already beginning to move. Change was coming. Daniel could feel it. What he did not know was something else, something that had been hidden from him for 35 years. A letter that had never been delivered. A letter that would have changed everything. And the woman who had arrived the day before, the one who said this land never belonged to him. She carried the same name, Emily Carter. But Daniel still did not know the truth. Emily Carter had never received his promise. Not once. Not in 35 years. And somewhere deep inside the quiet mountains, fate was slowly preparing to reveal the story. Both of them had lived without ever understanding. But if you had waited for someone for 35 years, would you still believe they might return? Or would you finally let the past go? The next morning, the fog did not feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped outside. The mountains were quiet as usual. But something in the air had changed. A strange tension drifted through the valley like a storm that had not yet decided to arrive. Daniel walked toward the road. The large sign still stood there. Luxury mountain resort opening soon. He stared at it for a moment, then turned away. He had survived droughts, fires, market crashes, but this felt different, because this time the threat was not nature. It was people, and people were harder to reason with. Daniel was fixing a loose fence post when he heard a car approaching, not the rough sound of an old truck. Smooth, quiet, expensive. He did not have to turn around to know who it was. The same long black car rolled slowly to a stop near the gate. The driver stepped out first again, but this time another man stepped out as well. The man wore a dark suit despite the warm morning. His hair was neatly combed and he carried a leather folder under his arm. Daniel wiped the dirt from his hands and waited. The woman stepped out last. The same woman from yesterday, Emily Carter. She walked toward him calmly, her eyes studying the land once more. Behind her, the suited man followed. Daniel noticed how carefully the man looked at everything. The buildings, the fences, the field. The kind of careful observation people make when they are calculating value. Emily stopped a few steps away. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. Daniel crossed his arms. "Morning." The suited man stepped forward. "Good morning, sir. My name is Richard Holden. I represent Northern Ridge Development." Daniel did not shake his hand. Holden continued anyway. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Daniel looked at him calmly. "I do not remember scheduling a meeting." Holden gave a polite smile. "Sometimes important matters cannot wait for appointments." Emily glanced toward the old barn. Then back to Daniel. "We came to discuss ownership of this property." Daniel felt his chest tighten again. 19. Holden opened the leather folder and removed several documents. "These are official land records," he said. "According to the county archives, this land was originally purchased by Thomas Carter in 1958. Daniel nodded slowly. "My father," Holden continued. "However, the property was later transferred through a private agreement to another family. Emily Carter family." Daniel frowned. "That is not possible." Holden raised a page. "It was never properly contested because the documentation was incomplete. But the inheritance claim still exists." Emily looked at Daniel carefully as Holden spoke. "My father passed away 3 years ago," she said quietly. "While reviewing his estate, we discovered records regarding this land." Daniel shook his head. "Your father never owned this farm." Holden stepped forward slightly. "The documents suggest otherwise." Daniel could feel his heart beginning to pound. The wind moved through the dry coffee trees behind him. For decades, this land had been the one thing that never changed. Now strangers were telling him it was never his. Holden placed a new document on the hood of the car. "We are not here to create conflict," he said. "In fact, our company is prepared to offer you a very generous solution." Daniel already knew what was coming. Holden spoke clearly. $2 million for the property. Immediate transfer. No legal complications. Emily watched Daniel face carefully. $2 million. The number hung in the air like a distant echo. For a moment, Daniel imagined what that kind of money meant. A new house. Comfort. Rest. No more fighting drought and broken machines. But then his eyes drifted toward the old coffee tree standing in the field. The one he had planted with Emily. The promise returned to him like a voice from the past. "Promise me you will not sell this land. No matter what happens." Daniel looked back at the two strangers. "No," he said. Holden blinked once. "I am sorry," Daniel repeated. "No, I will not sell." The lawyer folded his hands calmly. "Mr. Carter, I do not believe you fully understand the situation. If the inheritance claim is validated in court, you may not have a choice." Daniel took a step forward. "This farm has been in my family for 60 years. My father worked this land. I worked this land. And I am not leaving." Emily watched him closely. Something in his voice felt strangely familiar. A quiet stubbornness. Holden closed his folder. "Then I suppose we will allow the legal system to resolve this matter." Daniel said nothing. Holden nodded politely. "We will file the claim this week." Emily spoke again before returning to the car. "Mr. Carter." Daniel looked at her. Her eyes moved slowly across the farm again. The old barn. The dry trees. The weathered house. "Why did you stay here all these years?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. He almost answered honestly, "Because of you." But he stopped himself. Instead, he simply said, "Because this is my home." Emily studied him for a moment longer. Then she nodded slightly. The three of them returned to the car. The engine started quietly. As the vehicle pulled away, dust drifted across the road again. Daniel stood alone in the field. The mountains looked the same as they always had. But everything had changed. A lawsuit was coming. A company with unlimited money was coming. And the woman who carried the name Emily Carter had just challenged everything he had protected for 35 years. Daniel turned slowly back toward the old coffee tree. He touched the trunk again. Rough bark. Strong roots. Still standing. He whispered softly, "Looks like we have a fight ahead of us, old friend." But somewhere in the back of his mind, another question had begun to grow. A question he was almost afraid to ask. Why did the woman look so much like her? And if her name really was Emily Carter, then who had he been waiting for all these years? The valley felt different after the visit. For years, Daniel had lived with the quiet certainty that nothing would ever disturb the farm again. Time had slowly erased the world around him, leaving only the mountains, the old house, and the coffee trees that refused to completely die. But now something had shifted. The arrival of Emily Carter had stirred the past in a way Daniel could not explain. 2 days later, she returned. This time there was no black car with a driver waiting nearby. She arrived in a smaller vehicle, dusty from the road, as if she had chosen to drive herself. Daniel noticed her before she reached the gate. He was repairing the door of the old barn when he heard the engine stop. He did not look up immediately. He finished tightening the last screw. Only then did he step outside. Emily stood near the fence, looking across the fields again. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "My lawyer believes there may be missing documents in the older structures." Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth. "You mean the barn?" "Possibly," she replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then I suppose you should take a look." He turned and began walking toward the building. Emily followed. The barn had once been the busiest place on the farm. During harvest season, workers filled the space with baskets of coffee cherries while machines sorted and dried the beans. Now the structure stood mostly silent. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that slipped between the wooden boards. Daniel pushed open the large door. The hinges groaned loudly. Emily stepped inside carefully. The smell of old wood and earth surrounded them. She walked slowly across the room, studying everything. The sorting tables, the rusted machinery, stacks of empty burlap sacks. It felt like stepping into a memory that had been left untouched for decades. Daniel watched her quietly. There was something strange about the way she moved through the space. Not like a stranger, more like someone trying to remember where things used to be. Emily stopped near the far wall. Her hand brushed across a wooden beam. Then she turned slightly. "My father used to talk about this place," she said. Daniel looked surprised. "Your father was here?" She nodded. "Many years ago. He said the mountains smelled like coffee after the rain." Daniel leaned against one of the tables. That sounds like something he would remember. Emily walked toward an open window. Outside, the small stream behind the farm glimmered in the sunlight. "Is that the creek?" she asked. Daniel followed her gaze. "Yes. It runs through the back of the property." Emily stared at it for a long moment, almost as if the sight triggered something buried deep in her memory. Without thinking, she said quietly, "We used to sit near that water." Daniel felt his body stiffen. "What did you say?" he asked. Emily blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just something my father once mentioned." Daniel studied her face, but he did not push further. Instead, he said, "If you want to see the rest of the property, we should go now before it gets too hot." Emily nodded. They walked outside together. The sun had risen high above the hills. Warm light stretched across the field. Daniel led her through the narrow paths between the coffee trees. Many of the plants were dry now, their branches thin and tired. But here and there a few still carried small green cherries. Emily touched one gently. "These trees are very old," she said. "Some of them are older than both of us," Daniel replied. She smiled faintly. "You kept them alive." Daniel shrugged. "They keep themselves alive. I just try not to get in their way." They walked further into the field. Eventually, they reached the old tree standing apart from the others. The same tree Daniel had planted 35 years ago. Emily stopped the moment she saw it. For a long time, she simply stared. Her fingers slowly reached toward the bark. "You planted this tree," she said softly. Daniel felt his heart skip. "What makes you say that?" Emily ran her hand along the trunk. The bark was rough but strong. "I do not know," she admitted. "It just feels familiar." Then she added quietly, "You planted this tree for me." Daniel froze. The words hit him like a sudden gust of wind. For a moment he could not breathe. "How would you know that?" he asked slowly. Emily looked confused. "I do not know," she repeated. "Maybe I am imagining things." Daniel stared at the tree, then at her. The sunlight moved through the branches above them. For 35 years he had lived with a memory of planting that tree beside a young woman named Emily. And now this stranger had spoken the same truth, without explanation. A quiet suspicion began forming in his mind. But he pushed it away. It was impossible. Time did not work like that. People did not return after decades looking like echoes of the past. They continued walking. Eventually they reached the small creek behind the farm. Water flowed slowly over smooth stones. Emily stepped closer to the edge. The sound of the water seemed to calm her. She knelt down and dipped her fingers into the stream. "The water is cold," she said. "Mountain water always is," Daniel replied. For a moment they both watched the current move. Then Emily asked a question. "Why did you never leave this place?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at the hills surrounding the farm. The same hills that had watched his entire life pass. "Because someone once asked me not to," he said finally. Emily looked at him. "Someone important?" Daniel nodded. "Very important." She considered that quietly. "Do you still believe that person will come back?" she asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether promises still matter after 35 years. Emily looked down at the water again. Her reflection moved across the surface. And for a moment she wondered something herself. Why did this place feel like a memory she had never lived? Why did the old farmer voice sound so familiar? And why did the tree standing in the field feel like a piece of her own past? But the answer to those questions was still hidden. Somewhere inside the farm. Waiting. Buried in a place neither of them had looked yet. A place inside the old barn, where a small wooden box had been collecting dust for 35 years. And inside that box rested a letter that had never reached the person it was meant for. A letter that could finally explain everything. The afternoon light began to soften as they walked back toward the barn. The mountains had turned a deeper shade of blue, and a quiet wind moved gently across the valley. Dust lifted from the dry road in slow spirals. Neither of them spoke. Something about the day had changed the space between them. It was no longer the distance between strangers, but it was not yet the closeness of people who understood each other either. It was something uncertain. Something waiting. Daniel pushed the barn door open again. The wood groaned the same way it had earlier, as if the building itself remembered every person who had ever walked through it. Emily stepped inside. The air felt cooler now. She walked deeper into the room, her eyes moving slowly across the old tools and shelves. Daniel climbed a narrow wooden ladder that leaned against the far wall. Above them was a small storage loft. Years ago, it had been filled with sacks of beans waiting to be transported down the mountain. Now it held only dust and forgotten objects. Daniel reached the top and began moving aside a few boxes. Emily watched from below. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Old records," he replied. "There might be something stored up here." He pushed one box aside, then another. Finally, his hand touched something small and wooden. He paused. The object was a small wooden box. Simple, weathered by time. Daniel frowned slightly. "I do not remember this being here," he said. Carefully, he climbed down the ladder with the box in his hands. Emily stepped closer. Daniel brushed the dust away with his sleeve. The lid was slightly loose. Inside the box were several items: old photographs, a thin notebook, and an envelope. The paper had turned yellow with age. Daniel opened the box slowly. Emily leaned closer. The photographs showed scenes from decades ago. Workers harvesting coffee, the barn filled with baskets, a younger Daniel standing beside a young woman. Emily froze. The woman in the photograph looked exactly like the younger version of the face she had seen in the old picture inside Daniel's house. Except this time the woman was smiling, bright, alive. Emily picked up the photo carefully. "Who is she?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at the picture. His voice softened. "Her name was Emily. Emily Carter. The same name as yours." Emily stared at the photograph longer. A strange feeling moved through her chest. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that reflected a life she had never lived. She placed the photo back inside the box. Then she noticed the envelope. Daniel had not touched it yet. The envelope was sealed. On the front was a name written in faded ink: Emily Carter. Both of them stared at it. Daniel's voice was barely more than a whisper. "I wrote that letter." Emily looked at him. "When?" 35 years ago." His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the envelope. "I thought I sent it," he said slowly. "But I must have left it here. Forgotten." Emily felt her heart begin to beat faster. "May I?" she asked gently. Daniel hesitated. Then he handed her the envelope. The paper felt fragile. Emily carefully opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat but firm. She unfolded the letter. For a moment, the room felt completely silent. Then she began to read. "I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, but I need you to know something. You asked me to promise that I would never sell the farm. I promise, no matter how long it takes, I will wait here. If you come back one day, I will be here. And if you never come back, I will still keep the land the way we dreamed, because some promises are worth an entire lifetime." Emily stopped reading. Her vision blurred. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. Daniel watched her carefully. "That letter was meant for the Emily I knew," he said quietly. But she never answered. Emily lowered the paper slowly. Her voice trembled, because she never received it. Daniel looked confused. "What do you mean?" Emily took a breath. 35 years ago, my father sent me overseas," she said. "He told me the farm was finished. He said you had decided to sell everything." Daniel felt the room begin to spin. "That is not true," he said. "I waited. Every year." Emily nodded slowly. "I know that now." She held the letter gently in her hands. "When I left the valley, my father gave me a letter he said was from you." Daniel stared at her. "What did it say?" Emily's voice broke slightly. "It said goodbye. It said you had decided the farm was not worth saving." Daniel felt something inside his chest collapse. "I never wrote that." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. I believe you. Silence filled the barn. 35 years. 2 lives lived apart. All because of one letter that had never been delivered. Daniel leaned against the wooden table. His voice was quiet. I thought you chose to leave. Emily shook her head. I thought you chose to forget. The wind moved softly through the cracks in the barn walls. Outside, the valley looked the same as it always had. But inside the barn, something had changed forever. Emily looked again at the letter in her hands. 35 years, she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. 35 years. Emily looked at him with tears still in her eyes. You really waited all that time? Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the open door of the barn. Beyond it stood the old coffee tree in the field, the one they had planted together. Finally, he said quietly, some promises are easy to make, but very difficult to break. Emily followed his gaze to the tree. And for the first time she understood something that had been invisible before. The old farmer had not stayed here because of the land. He had stayed because of her. Because of a promise made beside a tiny coffee seedling 35 years ago. And now the truth had finally surfaced. But another problem still remained. The corporation, the lawsuit, the land itself. Because even though the past had finally spoken, the future of the farm was still hanging by a thread. And the people who wanted to destroy it had far more power than either of them realized. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains when they left the barn. The valley looked quiet again. Too quiet. For 35 years, Daniel had believed the hardest part of his life was waiting. But now he understood something else. Waiting had only been the beginning. The real battle was about to start. Emily stepped outside and looked toward the old coffee tree standing alone in the field. The tree seemed different now. A moment ago it had been a symbol of the past, a promise, a memory. Now it felt like something more fragile, something that could disappear. Daniel closed the barn door slowly behind them. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Emily said softly, 35 years. Daniel nodded. 35 years. Emily looked toward the mountains. I spent most of my life believing you had chosen the farm over me. Daniel gave a faint, sad smile. And I spent mine believing you had chosen a different life. The wind moved across the valley again. For a moment, both of them simply stood there with the weight of those lost decades settling quietly between them. Then Emily turned toward him. Daniel, you should sell the land. The words felt heavy. Daniel looked at her slowly. What? Emily took a breath. The company that wants this valley is not small. Northern Ridge Development builds resorts all over the country. They already own most of the land around us. Daniel said nothing. Emily continued. They will keep pushing. They will bring lawyers, permits, regulations. Eventually, they will make it impossible for you to stay here. Daniel's eyes moved across the field. The broken fences, the tired soil, the old tractor rusting beside the barn. He knew she was not wrong, but something inside him refused to move. You think I stayed here all these years because of the land? He asked quietly. Emily hesitated. Daniel shook his head slowly. I did not keep this place because it was profitable. I kept it because of my promise. Emily felt a quiet ache in her chest. He looked toward the old coffee tree again. I told you I would never sell, he continued. Even if the farm disappeared. Even if the whole valley changed. That promise still matters. Emily watched him carefully. For the first time, she understood the full weight of what he had carried. 35 years. Not just waiting, believing. holding on to something the world had already forgotten. Daniel finally looked back at her. And now they want me to sell. After all that time, Emily lowered her gaze. She could not argue with him. But she also knew something he did not. The company had already started moving. The next morning, Daniel saw the first sign. 2 trucks were parked near the road. Men in construction helmets were placing metal posts along the hillside. A new fence. Daniel walked toward them. One of the workers nodded politely. "Morning, sir." "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. The worker pointed toward the hills. "New property line. Company bought that section yesterday." Daniel followed the direction of the man finger. The land they were fencing was part of the old access road that connected the farm to the Valley Highway. Without that road, trucks could not reach the farm. Supplies could not arrive. Harvest could not leave. Daniel felt a cold realization settle in his chest. They were not just buying land. They were surrounding him. 2 days later, the water pressure dropped. The small irrigation pipe that carried water from the mountain spring had been redirected. A notice appeared on the fence. Water access, under private development review. Emily arrived that afternoon. She had already heard. "They are squeezing the farm," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. The old man looked tired but calm. "They want me to give up." Emily looked around the valley. More survey markers had appeared across nearby fields. Several neighboring farms had already sold. Small houses stood empty, windows boarded. Signs of construction creeping closer every day. The valley was changing faster than anyone had expected. Emily turned toward Daniel. "You cannot fight them alone," she said. Daniel looked toward the old coffee tree again. Its branches moved gently in the wind. For decades, the tree had survived everything. Drought, storms, neglect. But even the strongest tree could not survive if the ground beneath it was taken away. Daniel's voice was quiet. "I was alone for 35 years. Emily stepped closer. "You are not alone anymore." Daniel looked at her. For the first time since she arrived in the valley, he allowed himself to truly believe that. But the reality around them was still brutal. Machines were moving. Lawyers were preparing documents. Money was reshaping the mountains. And the farm that had once filled the valley with coffee trees now stood like the last island before a rising tide. Emily looked toward the old barn. Then, back at Daniel. "There may still be something we have not seen," she said. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "My father was a complicated man," she continued. "He never did anything without leaving a record. If he believed this land mattered, there might be something in his estate files. Something the company does not want us to find." Daniel looked thoughtful. Emily's voice became quieter. "If we find proof that this farm was meant to stay in the family, Northern Ridge cannot take it so easily." Daniel crossed his arms. "And if there is nothing?" Emily hesitated. "Then we may have to prepare for a different kind of fight." Daniel nodded slowly. The wind moved across the valley again. The old coffee tree stood silent in the field. Waiting. Watching. It had once been the symbol of a promise. Now it was becoming something else. A line that could not be crossed. And the people who wanted to erase that promise were already preparing their final move. The next few days passed with a quiet urgency. For the first time in many years, Daniel was no longer working alone. Emily moved through the old farmhouse with a careful determination. Opening drawers, searching through cabinets, studying every document that had survived the decades. The house itself seemed to watch them. The same wooden walls that had held Daniel memories for 35 years now held the possibility of answers. Outside, the valley continued changing. Construction vehicles appeared more often on the distant hills. Survey flags multiplied along the surrounding land. Every evening, the lights from the workers' camps glowed faintly in the distance like small fires creeping closer to the farm. Northern Ridge development was moving quickly. Too quickly. Inside the house, Emily spread several old folders across the dining table. Daniel stood nearby, holding a worn leather notebook he had found in one of the storage cabinets. "Most of these records are from your father," she said. Daniel nodded. He kept everything. Receipts, planting schedules, weather notes. Emily flipped through another folder. "But something is missing." Daniel looked at her. "What kind of something?" "A final decision," she said. "My father never closed a legal matter without writing it down. He believed documents were stronger than memories." Daniel leaned slightly against the wall. "Maybe he never finished the paperwork." Emily shook her head slowly. "No, that does not feel right." She stood up and walked toward the living room. Above the fireplace, the old photograph of Daniel and the young Emily still hung on the wall. Emily studied it again. The young woman in the picture looked fearless, certain, as if the future had never crossed her mind. Emily whispered quietly to herself, "What happened to you?" Then her eyes moved toward a small wooden cabinet beneath the photograph. Daniel's voice came from behind her. "That cabinet belonged to my father." Emily opened the door. Inside were several thick binders. Most of them contained farm records. But at the very bottom was a thin envelope sealed with an old wax stamp. Emily lifted it carefully. The paper felt different, more official. Daniel stepped closer. "What is that?" Emily examined the front. Her breath caught slightly. "My father," handwriting. Daniel felt his heart begin to beat faster. Emily slowly broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope was a folded legal document. She opened it carefully. Several paragraphs filled the page. Emily began reading silently. At first, her expression remained calm. Then something changed. Her eyes widened. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Emily looked up. Her voice was barely steady. "Daniel, this is my father will." Daniel frowned. "But he died 3 years ago." Emily nodded. "Yes, but this document was written much earlier. Before I left the valley." Daniel waited. Emily continued reading aloud. "Upon my passing, the property known as Carter Ridge Farm shall remain under joint stewardship. The land shall not be sold without mutual agreement. The ownership of the farm is granted equally to Daniel Carter and Emily Carter." Daniel felt the room fall completely silent. He stared at her. "Say that again?" Emily repeated the final line. "Ownership granted equally to Daniel Carter and Emily Carter." Daniel leaned heavily against the table. "Your father gave us both the farm." Emily nodded slowly. "Yes." Daniel's mind raced. "But then why did the company claim the land belonged only to your family?" Emily's eyes moved back to the document. There was a second page. She turned it carefully. At the bottom of the page were 2 signatures, her father and a witness. Emily read the witness name. Her voice grew colder. "Richard Holden." Daniel immediately recognized the name. "The lawyer." Emily folded the papers slowly. "He knew." Daniel's voice dropped. "He knew the truth the whole time." Emily nodded. "And he hid it." The silence in the house grew heavier. Outside, the wind moved through the valley again. For decades, Daniel had believed he was protecting the farm for someone who had disappeared. Now he realized something else. The farm had never truly belonged to only one of them. It had always been meant for both. Emily looked around the room. Her father had known, even if he had forced her to leave the valley long ago, even if pride and misunderstanding had separated two young people. Somewhere in his final decision, he had tried to repair what had been broken. Daniel spoke quietly. "This changes everything." Emily nodded. "Yes. If this will is presented in court, Northern Ridge cannot claim sole ownership." Daniel looked toward the window. The old coffee tree stood in the fading light outside. For years, it had symbolized a promise made by two young people. Now it meant something else. Proof that the land had always been theirs together. Emily folded the document carefully. "Tomorrow we show this to the court," she said. Daniel looked at her. "And to the village." Emily smiled faintly. "Yes, because Northern Ridge is about to learn something very important." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Emily looked out toward the valley. "That this farm was never meant to become a resort. And some promises cannot be erased by money." But even as hope began returning to the old farmhouse, something else was already happening down the road. Northern Ridge Development had grown impatient, and the machines waiting beyond the hills were about to start moving. The machines arrived at sunrise. Daniel heard them before he saw them. The deep growl of heavy engines rolled across the valley like distant thunder. The sound echoed off the mountains and settled into the quiet fields. For a moment, Daniel stood still on the porch of the farmhouse. He already knew what it meant. Northern Ridge had decided not to wait for the court. Emily stepped outside beside him. She had heard the engines too. Across the road, a line of trucks appeared through the morning fog. Bulldozers, excavators, survey vehicles, and behind them a convoy of black company trucks. They stopped at the entrance of the farm. Several men stepped out. Among them was Richard Holden. The lawyer walked forward calmly, his suit untouched by the dust of the road. Daniel slowly stepped down from the porch. Emily followed. They walked together toward the gate. The machines idled loudly behind Holden, their engines vibrating through the ground like impatient animals. Holden spoke first. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Emily Carter. Emily held the folded document firmly in her hand. "You should not be here," she said. Holden gave a thin smile. "Actually, we have every right to begin preliminary construction. Our permits were approved yesterday." Daniel looked past him at the bulldozers. "Construction on what?" he asked quietly. Holden gestured toward the valley. "The access road will be widened today. The barn and several trees will need to be cleared to make room." Daniel felt the words settle in his chest like cold iron. Several trees. He knew exactly which ones. Emily stepped forward. "That will not happen." Holden raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Emily unfolded the document. "Because you lied." She held up the will. "My father's estate clearly states that the farm belongs jointly to Daniel Carter and Emily Carter." Holden's expression barely changed. He studied the paper from a distance. Then he smiled again. "That document was never filed with the county, which means legally it has no authority." Daniel's voice became firm. "It will have authority in court." Holden shrugged slightly. "Perhaps, but construction begins today." Behind him, one of the bulldozers started moving. Its metal blade lowered slowly toward the dirt road leading into the farm. Daniel stepped forward. He walked directly into the path of the machine. The bulldozer operator immediately slowed. Daniel stopped in front of the gate, his old boots planted firmly in the dust. For a moment, everything became still. "Holden, see you." "Mr. Carter," Please step aside." Daniel did not move. No. The engine continued to rumble. The operator looked uncertain. Emily stepped beside Daniel. "Then you will have to move both of us," she said. Holden glanced at his watch. "You are making this unnecessarily dramatic." He turned toward the operator. "Proceed." The bulldozer inched forward. The blade pushed against the dirt. But Daniel remained exactly where he stood. The machine stopped again. The driver leaned out the window. "Sir, I cannot drive over him." Holden frowned. "Then move him." But something unexpected happened before anyone could act. A pickup truck rolled down the road. Then another. Then another. George Whitaker stepped out of the first truck. "Morning, Daniel," he called calmly. Daniel glanced back. Behind George, more trucks were arriving. Neighbors. Farmers from across the valley. Men and women who had lived in the mountains their entire lives. George walked forward and stood beside Daniel. "Thought you might need a little company," he said. Another man stepped forward. Then a woman. Then several more. Within minutes, a line of people had formed across the entrance of the farm. Silent. Determined. Holden looked around with growing irritation. "What is this?" Emily stepped forward. "This valley," she said clearly. "These farms. These families. They are not empty land for your company to buy." She held the wheel high enough for everyone to see. This farm was meant to belong to the community that built it. Holden scoffed. "Sentimental speeches do not stop development projects." Emily's voice became stronger. "Then let me make this very clear." She turned toward the gathered villagers. "My father tried to divide this valley once. He thought money would solve everything. He was wrong." She looked back at Holden. "This land will not become a luxury resort." Daniel felt something warm rise inside his chest. Emily continued. "This farm will become something else. Something that belongs to everyone here. A community coffee farm." The people around them began murmuring. George smiled slowly. "Now that is an idea I like." Emily pointed toward the fields. "We rebuild the trees. We share the harvest. The valley grows together again." For a moment, the entire road filled with quiet agreement. Holden looked around. The bulldozers. The villagers. The two people standing in front of the gate. Finally, he realized something. Even if he forced the machines forward, even if the lawyers fought for years, the valley would not cooperate. And a resort built in the middle of a hostile community was a losing investment. Holden closed his folder slowly. "This is not finished," he said. Emily met his gaze. "It is for today." Holden signaled to the drivers. One by one, the engines shut down. The trucks turned around. The machines slowly rolled back toward the highway. The valley grew quiet again. Daniel watched until the last vehicle disappeared beyond the hill. Only then did he breathe out. George clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for an old farmer," he said. Daniel smiled faintly. Beside him, Emily looked out across the fields. The old coffee tree stood exactly where it had always been. But now it meant something different. It was no longer just a promise between two young people. It had become the symbol of something larger. A place worth protecting. And for the first time in 35 years, the farm was no longer standing alone. The valley had returned. 1 year later, the valley looked completely different. Spring had returned to the mountains. But this time, the change was not only in the weather. The farm was alive again. Rows of young coffee trees stretched across the hills where dry soil had once dominated the land. Fresh green leaves shimmered in the sunlight. and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of blossoms. Where rusted machinery had once sat abandoned, people now worked side by side. Farmers from neighboring lands, young volunteers from nearby towns, families who had once believed the valley was dying. Children ran through the narrow paths between the trees, their laughter echoing across the hills. The old barn had been repaired, the wooden boards replaced, the roof strengthened. Inside, new equipment stood where dust had gathered for decades. Sacks of freshly harvested coffee beans filled the room. The sign at the entrance of the property had changed, too. The old resort sign had disappeared months ago. In its place stood a simple wooden board carved by hand. Carter Ridge Community Coffee Farm. People from across the region had begun visiting the valley again. Some came to help. Some came to learn. Some came simply to see the place where a small group of farmers had refused to disappear. And at the center of it all stood the same farmhouse. Older, weathered, but stronger than it had been in years. Daniel sat on the porch in a wooden chair. The afternoon sun warmed the valley. In his hands he held a small cup of coffee made from the first full harvest the farm had produced in nearly 2 decades. He took a slow sip. For a moment he closed his eyes. The taste was rich, strong, familiar. Footsteps approached across the porch. Emily stepped outside carrying 2 more cups. She placed one beside him. "Careful," she said. "This batch is stronger than the last one." Daniel smiled slightly. "That means the soil is finally waking up again." Emily sat in the chair beside him. They both looked out across the valley. Workers were finishing the last rows of planting for the season. George stood near the barn explaining something loudly to a group of younger farmers. Not much had changed about him, except now he seemed happier. Emily followed. Daniel gazed toward the far field. The old coffee tree still stood there, but now something was different. The branches were full again. Small white blossoms covered the tree. Bright, delicate, alive. Emily smiled softly. "Look at that." Daniel leaned forward slightly. The old tree had not flowered like that in many years. "It took 35 years, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Some things grow slowly." They watched the blossoms move gently in the breeze. The same tree that had once symbolized a promise. Then a memory. Then a fight. Now it represented something else. Renewal. Emily rested her hands in her lap. "You know," she said, "when I left this valley all those years ago, I thought the story of this place was finished." Daniel looked at her. "And now," Emily smiled, "now it feels like the beginning." Daniel leaned back in his chair. The mountains glowed softly in the late afternoon light. For decades, he had believed the most important part of his life had already happened. The promise. The waiting. But now he understood something different. Life did not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it circled back. Sometimes it took decades to return to the place where it began. Emily spoke again. "It took me 35 years to come back here." Daniel looked at her. His eyes were calm. "And I spent 35 years waiting." They both laughed quietly. Not because the years had been easy, but because the waiting had not been meaningless. A group of children ran across the field near the old tree. Their laughter carried across the valley. Emily watched them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that letter had arrived on time?" Daniel thought about the question. Then he shook his head gently. "No." "Why not?" "Because then we might never have learned how much the promise mattered." Emily looked at the blossoms again. The wind moved through the branches. Soft white petals drifted slowly down into the grass. Daniel lifted his coffee cup once more. Some love stories, he said slowly, do not need to run fast. Emily waited. Daniel looked across the valley, at the people working together, at the children running between the trees, at the farm that had survived everything. They only need enough patience to wait. The camera slowly pulled back. The valley stretched wide beneath the mountains. Rows of coffee trees glowing green in the afternoon light. At the center of the field stood the old tree covered in white blossoms. A tree that had once held a promise. A promise that had waited 35 years to finally bloom. We think. Sometimes the seasons change many times before the truth finally finds its way back home. When Emily returned to the valley, she did not simply rediscover an old farm. She rediscovered a man who had kept a promise that most people would have abandoned long ago. And Daniel discovered that the waiting he once thought was lonely had never been meaningless. The old coffee tree standing in the field had watched everything. It had watched two young people plant a tiny seed in the soil. It had watched storms pass over the mountains. It had watched droughts dry the land and silence fill the valley. And still, the tree remained, just like the promise. When the valley came together to protect the farm, something beautiful happened. The story stopped belonging only to Daniel and Emily. It became something larger. Neighbors who had once believed the valley was fading returned to help rebuild it. Young people who had never seen the farm alive before began planting new trees. And slowly, the land that once seemed tired and forgotten began to breathe again. If you could stand there today, you would see something different from the lonely place where our story began. You would see rows of young coffee trees stretching across the hills. You would hear laughter echoing between the barns. You would see children running through the fields where silence once lived. And at the center of it all, the same old tree still stands. But now it carries blossoms again. Not because it was rushed. Not because someone forced it to bloom. But because time, patience, and care finally gave it the chance. And maybe that is the quiet truth hidden inside this story. Some things in life do not grow quickly. Trust does not. Love does not. And the promises we make to each other rarely follow the schedules we imagine. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they take decades. But when they are real, they endure. Daniel once believed the most important part of his life had already passed. He believed the promise he made beside that tiny coffee seedling was simply something he had to carry until the end. But in the end, that promise did something unexpected. It brought life back to an entire valley. And perhaps that is the gentle reminder this story leaves with us tonight. Not every act of patience feels meaningful while we are living through it. Not every quiet choice we make will be understood by the people around us. Sometimes it will even look like we are standing still while the whole world moves on. But time has a strange way of revealing the value of the things we choose to hold on to. A promise, a memory, a place that still feels like home. And maybe, somewhere in your own life, there is something like that too. Something small that others might overlook. Something that asks for patience. Something that asks you to believe just a little longer. If that is true, then perhaps Daniel's story is not only about the past. Perhaps it is also about the quiet courage it takes to keep believing in something when the world says it is already over. Because sometimes the most meaningful chapters of life begin long after we think the story has ended. So tonight, as we leave the valley and the mountains behind, remember the image of that old coffee tree, a tree that waited 35 years to bloom again. And maybe ask yourself, just once, what quiet promise in your own life might still be waiting for its season to blossom?